Hello, class. Welcome to week 3 of Philosophy of God at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. This is your professor, John Studi, and this week we're going to be talking about some of the mechanics at work within St. Thomas's five ways overall. In particular, I'm going to be looking at what I think is the existential core of all five of St. Thomas's arguments. And for those of you who are looking at the lecture notes as well, you'll know that there's a distinction between various different schools of Thomistic thought and how to approach St. Thomas's philosophical writings, theological writings, according to different emphases that somebody might place upon them. I myself belong to what's called the existentialist camp, and of course, I wouldn't say that I'm an existential Thomist necessarily. I mean, I would say that because I think that's the authentic expression of Thomism. Really, I want to try to take Thomism as a whole, not be confined to any particular school. In fact, I don't even want to be confined to Thomism necessarily. I just think St. Thomas really got it right on a great number of points. That he has a lot of insights to offer the world. But one of the big differences between the Aristotelian Thomists, which most of us are going to be familiar with through people like Ralph McInerney, D.Q. McInerney, through Edward Fazer or Jeffrey Brower, or a whole host of other wonderful scholars, the existentialist position takes some of these insights and understands that, yes, Aristotle certainly had a major influence on St. Thomas, but we think that a good portion of these Aristotelian Thomist scholars have done a bit too much in terms of their appreciation for the Aristotelian elements of St. Thomas's philosophy. And what this has resulted in my opinion, is that they have forgotten or missed or left behind certain aspects of St. Thomas's insights, which make St. Thomas a really very formidable philosopher nowadays, and especially in light of certain contemporary discussions that if you go on to the philosophical blogosphere and kind of see what the arguments are about right now, you're seeing stuff like existential inertia and the divine attributes and a whole host of other things when it comes to natural theology and metaphysics that I think actually are resolved if we have a proper understanding of St. Thomas's metaphysical position. And perhaps, I wrote my thesis on this debate between the Aristotelian Thomists and the existential Thomists, and why I think the existential Thomist approach to metaphysics is the appropriate one. But that's neither here nor there, because what I'm going to be giving to you today is what I see to be the foundational elements of St. Thomas's philosophy that you need in order to gain a proper understanding of his approach to the five ways and to God in general. And while you can have a good approximation of Aquinas' arguments without these, I just don't think that you can really grasp their full import unless you understand some of these more obscure or less popular aspects of St. Thomas's philosophy. It's not less popular in that people don't like them, but they're not talked about very often. Things like the priority of esse as the uttermost example or instance of what actuality means. What it means to be an act means to exist for St. Thomas primarily, whereas for Aristotle, for instance, to be an act meant to be a substance. And so whereas Aquinas looks at the existence of a thing, which is something that's super categorical, so it actually goes outside Aristotle's 10 categories of being. Aristotle focused simply on the way that things exist, and for Aristotle to be meant to be a certain kind of thing, and so for him, the highest instance of act was essence or form. But Aquinas actually thinks that that's not the case. He says that the act of existence is something that is the act of all acts, even that, and the perfection of all perfections, even that of form and essence. And its beginning, and St. Thomas's five ways actually begin with that understanding. And as he progresses through these the different arguments, for instance, we can flip over to the next slide here, through in the prima via, through the observation of motion in the universe, or in the world, or the order of efficient causality, the fact that things cause other things, or he'll look at the reality of generation and corruption, which is things coming into being, going out of being, or the grades of perfections, or that things act towards determinate ends. All of these for him sort of strip away at the surface of the things of our experience. And now for Aquinas, what he's doing when he looks at these different phenomena, these different events that are happening in the world that appear before our senses, is he's not just looking at it in terms of formal abstraction, but rather he's looking at it in terms of the act of judgment. Things are in motion. Things are that which generate and corrupt. So things come into being and go out of being. There are grades of perfection. Well, every perfection derives from esse, or rather, if you look at he says that there are degrees of goodness, truth, and beauty in the world, or being in the world, or goodness, truth, and unity in the world, and all those are, St. Thomas's metaphysics, convertible with esse, primarily. And so when we're looking at the 5 ways, the best way to understand it is in light of esse. But to get to the point where we're able to articulate Aquinas' arguments in a way that is philosophically and metaphysically robust, there's still some more that we need to look out for. But the number one thing that we need to pay attention to in St. Thomas's arguments is we need to have this obsessive, laser-like focus on esse as the act of all acts, and that is exactly what St. Thomas is looking at. He's looking at the existence of things. For Aquinas, the arguments for God's existence do not occur in natural philosophy. I think that actually has some rather inscrutable difficulties involved with it, particularly at the far end of things, which you can read a little bit more about in the first section of the lecture notes. But for now, we know that St. Thomas, in many places, like in the his commentary on the Boethius' De Trinitate, question 6, article 4. I think it's in the body of the article, or it's in the reply to. He says that the metaphysician, his role is to study, also studies things in motion, just like the natural philosopher does. But instead of studying those things that are in motion according to their motion, the metaphysician studies things according to their habens esse, and that is precisely where St. Thomas places the beginning of metaphysics, insofar as we understand things as habens esse, which is a grasp and judgment, which we talked about last week. But earlier in that same commentary on Boethius' commentary, on Boethius' De Trinitate, Aquinas says that the philosophy, or that metaphysics, doesn't study God as its material object, but rather as its principal cause. And since the science of metaphysics is about things insofar as they habens esse, or that they have the act of existence, and we're looking at God in metaphysics, then metaphysics, or then the arguments for God's existence ought to approach God through esse rather than through certain things like natural philosophy. I mean, I've seen people take the third way, for instance, and the third way has a striking formal similarity to an argument that Aristotle makes in, I think it's Metaphysics 4, or is it Metaphysics 2? But anyway, he's arguing that every single one of the 4 causes has something that's irreducible. He eliminates an infinite regress of formal, material, final, and efficient causes. Or rather, moving causes, because efficient causality and moving causality is not quite the same thing for Aristotle. But the argument he uses from generation and corruption, actually for Aristotle, points to prime matter rather than a being that is necessary through itself. Like, those are two complete opposite things. Prime matter doesn't have any existence at all, and it is entirely dependent on other things in order for it to exist. But the argument that St. Thomas is making is one where he concludes with the existence of this thing who has existence necessarily through itself. So clearly something else is operating here. And I think it's precisely this distinction I talked about before, whereas Aristotle is looking at things in terms of form and essence and substance. Aquinas is, again, yes, looking at substances, but not the substances through the guise of form or essence, but rather he's looking at these substances or beings insofar as they have existence. And now each of the 5 ways has something in common. Starting on the right side here, because mix things up, right? such that some sensible feature of the world, like we talked about already, and that the ultimate idea is that it reflects the metaphysical structure of thing, or unveils the metaphysical structure of things, and then leads to God as their ultimate cause. And I'll also note that St. Thomas's arguments do not in any way rely upon the contemporary cosmology or any discovery from the special sciences, although these things may inform the way that Thomas might go about defending or articulating the five ways. I actually think that they're almost irrelevant, because they these five that contemporary insights from special sciences have very little bearing on St. Thomas's five ways, because the five ways are metaphysical in nature rather than ones that are learned through some sort of scientific deduction or process of elimination or through natural philosophy. And since metaphysics has foundations that are both prior to and that are prior to and more fundamental than the ones we discover in the special sciences, and that the special sciences presume the principles given by metaphysics, then the conclusions that this five ways are not probabilistic, but rather they're much more firmly established than anything that we find in the special sciences like physics or biology. Now, the five ways work primarily through efficient causality, although how they get to efficient causality is it's a little bit different. So as we talked about last week, there are two principal types of causes, and in a causal series, although I have a slight distinction a little bit later on here that wasn't mentioned last week. But the first and primary fundamental causes or principles, these things have the power, at least in a relative sense, to act on their own. And by a relative sense, I mean we can take a certain chain of, or take a certain causal chain. For instance, a train engine, a train with an engine, two boxcars, and a caboose. All right, great. The engine itself is something that has the ability to move on its own accord. Yes, of course. Yes, it needs the coal or the fuel or whatever it is, but that's mistaken the analogy for the argument. But the argument here is saying that within a particular causal chain, no matter if the intermediate causes are dependent upon another intermediate cause for their causal power, then it ultimately has to rest on some first primary fundamental principal cause. In this case, it would be the engine. Instrumental causes, in a way, they can't act on their own or bring about an effect on their own. A train car isn't going to move unless the engine is pulling it. Absolutely speaking here, we're not talking about obviously a train that's going down a hill. People will slip that on you sometimes if you use the train analogy. Okay, the train's going on the hill. So is the boxcar no longer is the boxcar itself now the first cause? Well, no, you've changed the analogy. Now gravity is the first cause. The mass of the earth or what have you. That is the first cause rather than the boxcar. When all things considered, the boxcar will never produce in itself motion. In the five ways, God is like the engine. He is the principal cause. Within him, he is the source of all the abilities in the reality found within things in our physical world, or in the sensible world. And like the engine that is an unpulled puller of boxcars, God is going to be the unmoved mover of things that are moved, or the uncaused cause of things that are caused. Even if this sort of causal series extends back, infinitely into the past through an accidentally ordered series, it still is the case that for a per se ordered causal series, it has to be such that there is a final terminating cause, which is first and gives the ability to cause throughout the whole of the series. And that's kind of how God works. Now, there's one more distinction within causes that I want to address really quickly here. So we have the causes that are in fieri, or causes of becoming, or causes in esse, and these are causes of existence. The cause in fieri is one where things it's on the order of form and matter. And what I mean by that is this. So with form and matter, there's always this interrelation between what's called proximate matter and then the form. And so if you want to have the right proximate matter for a horseshoe, you have to have something hard like iron, not soft like jello. It simply won't work. Or really soft, if you want to go that way. You can't make a horseshoe out of liquid water. It's simply not, the form is not going to adhere in it. It has to have some ability to take on that form. And so when the form of horseshoe enters into the matter, well, what happens? Well, the horseshoe becomes real. It becomes a real horseshoe. The iron now has taken on a different way of existing, way of behaving, that is proper to horseshoeness. Now, of course, this is an artifact, but it's neither here nor there for the purposes of understanding exactly what in fieri means. But what it does gain is a certain amount of independence from its initial cause, the blacksmith. The blacksmith, after he has made the horseshoe, no longer needs to cause that iron to be in the shape of the horseshoe. Why? Well, because the iron is of such a character that once it receives a particular form, because it's already rigid, it can hold that form without any further assistance. And one of the reasons for this is that this would be, I think, the categorical accident of position. Position. Yeah, there you go, position, because Aristotle talks about how a man could be sitting or standing, so there's this accident of position. And in the same way, when you have the iron bent in a particular shape, like a horseshoe, it now has this accident of position of being, shaped like a horseshoe. And the iron already exists, and it has this formal quality of rigidity, but also a certain degree of malleability. And because of those properties, when the form of horseshoe is given to the iron, it stays there, it remains. Causes in esse, on the other hand, are a little bit different. A cause in esse is something that is dependent, and it's on the way. So the horseshoe, once the blacksmith starts working on it, the form is being imparted, but it's an incomplete way. And whenever the blacksmith stops shaping the horseshoe, what we find is that the horseshoe no longer continues to, or the almost horseshoe doesn't complete its own act. It can't do that. It's not the kind of thing that shapes itself into a horseshoe. But when the blacksmith comes back, he starts hammering away again and starts forming it into that horseshoe. And this is this shows us, or this tells us that this cause in esse is actually more related to the per se causal series, because per se causal series are ones which are always present to the effect, and insofar as the effect is continued, the cause must also be continued. And then a difference here is that one other thing is that because it's always dependent. Once the cause stops, the effect stops. And so if you think of a candle or a light producing illumination in the room, once that light goes out, the air doesn't have the capacity to remain illuminated of its own accord. The room's going to get dark the second the light goes dark. Or the same way, if you have water in a glass cup and somebody comes along and smashes the cup, the water is not going to retain the shape of the cup. It's going to become a puddle on the ground, with a whole bunch of glass in it. Not fun. And so when we talk about the cause in fieri, we're talking about the causes of becoming, and these things can be independent. They have a certain independent existence from their initial cause because of what's presumed by the initial cause on the level of form and matter. And so again, when a thing takes on a new form, there's already something already existing with certain properties proper to that form. But when it comes to causes in esse, the cause is always dependent on the effect. The effect is always dependent on the cause. And whenever you find the effect, you will find the cause. And on the order of essence and existence, well, what do we find? And I'll address this in a minute here. But without existence, nothing exists whatsoever. And in fact, essence, as we'll find out shortly, is actually considered just in itself, precisely in itself, non-being. It has nothing. And so if it is given existence by some cause, and that cause no longer grants it existence, then it can no longer remain in existence, and it will cease to exist immediately. I'm going to scoop past that a little bit. And so within the 5 ways, there is this basic cosmological reasoning, which you find from Aquinas' De Ente et Essentia, as well as a couple other places, where he says that whatever belongs to a thing is efficiently caused by either the principles of its essence or from an external principle. Esse itself cannot be efficiently caused by the form or essence of a thing. Therefore, everything in which esse is distinct from its essence has its esse in virtue of an external cause. This external cause must be a pure esse tantum, or pure esse purus, or in some cases they call it ipsum esse subsistens. Number 5. If this were not so, then we would have an infinite regress of causes of esse. But this is not possible because everything that is not esse tantum or ipsum esse subsistens has a cause of its being. Therefore, there is a first cause, which is esse tantum, and this is what we call God. But this is not possible because everything that is not esse tantum or ipsum esse subsistens has to have a cause of its being that's external to itself. Therefore, there is a first cause, which is esse tantum, which is what we call God, and therefore God exists. And now let's flesh this out just a little bit more.